Thank you, Annalie, for the introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Ian Wilkinson, and I thought I'd share with you this afternoon some of the highlights from Siemens' portfolio around energy storage. Now, we've heard from pretty much every presentation already this afternoon that storage comes in a variety of forms, and we will probably need most of the various forms of storage that are available to meet our future energy system needs. There's lots of versions of this graph. This is the one that I use within Siemens quite a lot. And really what I want to focus on today are just three of the areas. So I'm going to look at battery storage. Obviously, we've heard about batteries already. Very, very relevant within the context of electricity, sort of power generation markets. I also, given the name of this topic, what's hot in storage, I felt I had to talk a little bit about electrothermal, so thermal energy storage as well. But I also think it's important to consider the Power2X market. If we consider that typically in Western Europe, something like 60 to 70% of the energy we use is not electricity. Electricity markets are only 20, 25, maybe 30% in some cases of the energy that we use as a nation state. The other energy, predominantly in transportation and in heating, also needs to be decarbonised too. And it's important that we consider technologies that allow us to begin to decarbonise non-electricity generation parts of our energy sector. So here I'm going to talk about Power2X, chemical energy vectors, and really they all begin with hydrogen, and that's where I'm going to spend the bulk of my presentation. So this idea of sector coupling within Power2X really is trying to address those areas of our energy markets which are sort of beyond the traditional electricity market. And by generating a useful fuel or a useful feedstock. So this idea of Power2X is turning electrons into useful stuff, such as hydrogen, which you can then use as an energy store itself in the power generation market, but you can then use it as a feedstock for turning it into other fuels and other chemicals which support our economies and our lifestyles in other sectors. So you can look at the chemicals industry, and fertilizer and ammonia is a particular example that I'm going to come back to later. But potentially you can synthesize other fuels as well, so jet fuels that allows you to begin to think about carbon emissions from aviation and so on, and also ground transportation, so methanol, potentially even methane. These can all be synthesized from electrons using renewable power and help us decarbonize those traditionally more stubborn sectors of our energy systems. So if I look at electrothermal energy storage, just to begin with, the basic concept's pretty simple. I think you understand it. You take the renewable power generation, that electricity, run it through a resistor to turn it into heat. That heat is then stored in a large heat store. So hot rocks is a good one because rocks are a very cheap way of storing that energy. You can store it for a number of hours to a few days, possibly even weeks, depending on how well insulated it is. And then at a later date, you can have your working fluid back through your hot store and generate steam, for example, and run a steam turbine. And the nice thing about this is that the technology to do it is all very mature. It's essentially off the shelf. One particular idea that my colleagues over at Siemens Gamesa have been exploring is repurposing old coal-fired power stations, because quite often you have the heat exchangers and the steam boilers and the steam turbines there already. So it's a case of adding the hot rocks, and then you're able to very cost-effectively reuse what would otherwise become a redundant asset. And this has actually been demonstrated now. So there's a 130 megawatt-hour demonstrator now at Hamburg that was commissioned a few years ago and is up and running. And there's a program now underway to scale this technology up and deploy it on larger and larger scales. Very briefly say a few words. Oh yeah, just to say there's another talk on this from a colleague of mine, Max Schumacher, on Thursday in Theatre 8. If you want to know more about the electrothermal energy storage, then please go along to that presentation. Very quickly, just say a few words on batteries. We've heard quite a bit about batteries already today. So just to say that their deployment is ever increasing. We've heard about the increasing role batteries are playing alongside renewables as they penetrate our electricity generation market. And batteries are nearly getting quite big now. So this is an example of a 120 megawatt hour installation in US. But they also work on very small scales, on microgrids. So this is 600 kilowatt hour store on an island, but it makes a real difference in terms of the stability of the grid in that kind of environment. And also a range of potential applications, so frequency response, frequency regulation. These are examples in Germany where you get typically a megawatt or so power output, relatively small energy store, but they're playing an important role in deferring grid reinforcement costs and keeping the frequency within the expected parameters. So moving on to the bulk of my presentation, what I wanted to talk about was Power2X, and really I want to motivate this by the ability this gives us to address the carbon emissions from traditionally stubborn sectors of our energy and our energy systems. And as I say, they're very significant. 2/3 or more of the energy we consume typically comes from transportation and heating, and predominantly today they're almost entirely fossil-based, even now. So I'm looking at chemical energy storage and Power2X for the remainder of this session. And really the starting point for all this is hydrogen production. So we have our renewable generation on the left. This can be intermittent renewables, so wind and solar, or it can be more continuous renewables such as hydroelectric, wave power, tidal, biomass. I don't really mind actually where the energy comes from as long as it's not derived from a fossil source. Obviously that electricity has a role to play in our energy systems, just as electricity, straight onto the grid or battery storage as we've heard already today. Or you can run it through an electrolyzer and produce hydrogen. And then you have a chemical energy vector, a chemical fuel and a feedstock, which is really useful in a number of different sectors which traditionally have been difficult to decarbonize. So we can use it as a feedstock in industry. I spoke about ammonia production. The majority of the hydrogen that's produced in an industrial environment today is actually used for ammonia production. So ammonia, the world makes something like 180 million tons of ammonia a year, and obviously hydrogen is a required feedstock for that. Hydrogen begins to allow you to use it in mobility, for ground transportation and potentially even for aviation. So we can start thinking about decarbonising, how we might decarbonise transportation. And then, of course, it gives you another way of decarbonising electricity systems. So it becomes, it's a chemical fuel, it's dispatchable, we can run it through conventional generation, such as gas turbine assets, and you have all the advantages, really, of a fossil-based energy system, but here we've managed to begin to take the carbon emissions out of that energy sector. So the Siemens portfolio includes electrolyzers. This is the Silyzer 200, which is our first product from electrolysis point of view. It's a 1.25 megawatt baseload system. We've got 3 installed at Mainz in Germany, which give us close on 5 megawatt electrolysis. And we've recently launched the Silyzer 300, which is more of a platform product. It's a modularized system. So 24 modules shown here give you 17.5 megawatts of electrolysis capability. So that'll generate around 340 kilos of hydrogen per hour. We're also working hard to convert our gas turbine generation fleet over to hydrogen combustion. And what you can see here with these charts are the percentage hydrogen composition of the fuel that the gas turbine systems will tolerate today. So there's a mixture of dry low emission and wet low emission emissions control combustion systems here. You can see with the charts, but some of the fleet are already able to burn 100% hydrogen, and the program is underway to bring those other fleet systems with the other emission control systems for increasing amount of hydrogen to blend them into the fuel system that they use for both power generation and mechanical drive applications. So as I say, hydrogen really is where it all begins with Power2X, making that hydrogen in an emissions-free way. And then you've got a number of options really. You've got a portfolio of molecules that you could choose to synthesize from that hydrogen. Because the challenge with hydrogen really is it's very difficult to store and difficult to transport in bulk. It's hard to get a lot of hydrogen in a small volume. The volumetric energy density of hydrogen is very low. This is why, for example, on fuel cell electric vehicles, they've had to go on to really high pressures to get the 4 or 5 kilos of hydrogen that you need for a reasonable range on a fuel cell electric vehicle in a reasonable package. So fuel cell electric vehicles typically employ 700 bar fuel tanks, and it's quite a highly engineered system. It's it's carbon fibre, so it'd be a metal skin to give you the gas tight, carbon fibre reinforced package at 700 bar to get enough hydrogen in. But fuel tanks like that just don't scale. You can't make a fuel tank in a similar way. It just becomes uneconomic to do that in bulk for energy system purposes. So really it's advantageous to then synthesize a more familiar chemical fuel, methane, methanol, ammonia, even Fischer-Tropsch allows you to get to the higher chain hydrocarbons like diesel, DME and so on. There's a real portfolio of things you can choose. Obviously if you're going to make a hydrocarbon fuel you need a carbon source, and that could be CO2 captured from power generation processes or other industrial processes. And here Siemens is working on, as I'll show you in a few minutes, an electrolysis, so an electrochemical process of reducing CO2 to CO, to carbon monoxide, which then allows you to very readily combine that with hydrogen and make fuels like methane and methanol, and as I say, the higher hydrocarbon molecules through Fischer-Tropsch synthesis. I'd also like to spend a few minutes looking at ammonia, which is very interesting because for many reasons. It gives you a very effective hydrogen store. It's completely carbon-free, so you don't need a carbon dioxide source to synthesize ammonia. It's using nitrogen, which is almost 80% of the atmosphere. And the technology that we need to synthesize ammonia already exists. As I say, the world output of ammonia is something like 180 million tons. It's a very important chemical already. Most of the ammonia we make is for agriculture, used for fertilizer production, so it's very familiar in an industrial context. So here's a demonstrator that we've been working on at Siemens for synthesizing CO. So this is a small-scale proof of principle electrochemical process for turning CO2 into CO. This is a lab-based system, 2.5 kilowatt electrochemical cell for reducing CO2 to CO, and then using it as a feedstock, combining it with hydrogen for making valuable chemicals and fuels. If I think about ammonia a little bit more, just to conclude my presentation, then with ammonia we really have a valuable chemical, a useful feedstock in its own right, but also a fuel, a hydrogen energy vector that is completely carbon-free. And really I would suggest over the last few years the world is waking up to the potential of ammonia as an energy vector. The IMO recently published reports on the future of marine fuel, and ammonia features very highly in that, and also in energy storage and decarbonising energy systems reports in the UK and across the world globally. We're seeing ammonia increasingly considered as a way of solving the bulk transportation and storage problem that hydrogen presents us with. So if we use ammonia, then we've got very abundant raw materials. It's air and water, essentially, if you go the electrolysis route. And if we use renewable energy to synthesize the ammonia, then you have a carbon-free energy store. And then ammonia then becomes a carbon-free asset that you can participate in a variety of markets. So again, on the left, we've got this, the renewable generation. We've got electrolysis, nitrogen production. What I've christened agile Haber-Bosch synthesis here. So this is trying to somehow capture the idea of synthesizing ammonia from intermittent renewable energy. And then you can store the ammonia as a hydrogen store. You can ship it around the world very readily. The tankers to do that exist today. You can crack it back into hydrogen and use the hydrogen at some distant site from when you actually captured the renewable energy. So it opens up the idea of renewable energy imports and exports, again in a carbon-free way. And we can use it as an energy vector for transportation, so we can put the hydrogen directly in fuel cell electric vehicles, or we can run the hydrogen through a stationary fuel cell and produce electricity for battery electric vehicle recharging. It's a feedstock in chemicals, so particularly fertilizers, as I mentioned, but it's also used in everything from plastics and steel and clothing production to steel manufacture and so on. And ultimately, you can use it as a fuel for power generation in the traditional sense, using existing combustion technology, gas turbines and so on, for electricity generation at a different time and at a different location from where you captured that intermittent renewable energy in the first place. And in the UK, I've been working on and we launched last year actually, an ammonia energy storage system generator. So this is a proof of principle system for that, and as far as I'm aware, this was the first in the world that demonstrated the complete round trip from renewable energy to hydrogen, to ammonia synthesis, and then back to electricity again on the one site. So the test site is the photo in the middle. It's quite small, proof of principle, as I say. So it's a 13 kilowatt electrolyzer, a 30 kilowatt genset, just a methane engine basically that I run on ammonia. And we built that at the Rutherford Appleton laboratory just outside Oxford in the UK. And I'll be saying a few more words about this system at my talk tomorrow. Tomorrow afternoon, 12:30, in Theatre 10, which I think is just next door. So please come along to that if you want to hear more about that and ask me a few questions around that. But that's it for today. Thank you very much for your attention.